The rain had been falling over Atlanta for 3 hours before Angela Brooks finally clocked out of her shift, and it showed no sign of stopping. She pulled her hood up against the downpour, tucked her chin low, and started the 8-block walk to the bus stop that would carry her home to the narrow 2-room apartment she had rented for the past 4 years. At 30 years old, Angela had learned to measure her life in small, manageable units: the number of hours left in a shift, the number of days until rent was due, the number of patients she had checked on that evening before the relief nurse arrived. She was not unhappy, but she had long ago stopped expecting anything spectacular to find her. On that particular Tuesday night in October, she had no reason to believe anything would be different. She had no reason to believe that the old man sitting beneath the bus shelter at the corner of Peachtree and Vine would change the entire shape of her future. She walked toward him through the dark, her shoes soaking through at the seams, thinking only of getting home, of a hot shower, of sleep. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that 30 seconds later the man would collapse, and she would turn around, and nothing in her life would ever be the same again. 3 weeks after that night, a black limousine would idle in front of her building. A man in a suit would step out, carrying a sealed envelope with her name, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. And the life Angela Brooks had quietly, stubbornly been building one careful day at a time was about to be remade from the ground up. Angela had grown up in a small house in the Mechanicsville neighborhood of Atlanta, raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and still found time to press Angela's school uniform on Sunday nights and leave a hot breakfast on the table before dawn. Her mother, Darlene, had believed in 2 things above all others: hard work and the irreducible value of treating other people with decency. Those 2 beliefs had threaded themselves so deeply into Angela that she could not have separated them from herself if she tried. Darlene passed away from a cardiac event when Angela was 24, leaving her daughter with a small inheritance of maybe $600 in a savings account, a closet full of church clothes, and a moral compass that never seemed to waver no matter how difficult things became. Angela had spent the 6 years since her mother's death learning what it meant to be entirely alone in the world. She had a handful of colleagues she liked well enough, a neighbor named Mrs. Patterson who sometimes slipped baked goods under her door, and a patient named Gerald at the assisted living facility where she worked who called her sunshine every single morning without fail. But there was no family left nearby, no sister to call at midnight, no cousin to borrow $20 from in a pinch. Whatever Angela had, she had earned. Whatever she gave freely and without expecting return. She worked at Magnolia Gardens Senior Care, a mid-sized facility on the outskirts of Buckhead that smelled permanently of antiseptic and cafeteria rolls. Her official title was Certified Nursing Assistant, though in practice her responsibilities ranged far beyond what that title implied. She bathed residents who could no longer bathe themselves. She sat with people in their final hours because their families lived too far away or had simply stopped coming. She remembered birthdays and medication schedules and the names of grandchildren she had never met. She had learned, in the 6 years she had worked there, to carry grief lightly, not because she did not feel it, but because the work demanded that you find a way to keep going even after it arrived. When a resident passed, she would take a quiet moment in the break room, then wash her hands and return to the floor. That was the job. That was all of it, and the whole of it at once. She earned $16.40 an hour, which after taxes and the deductions for her health insurance premium left her with approximately $2,200 each month. Her rent was $1,050. The rest dissolved into groceries, the bus pass, her phone bill, and the slow grinding accumulation of small necessities that poverty always seemed to generate more of than wealth ever could. She had no savings account worth speaking of. She had no safety net beneath the wire she walked every month. There were nights she ate rice and canned beans for dinner, not because she lacked imagination, but because the math demanded it, and she had long since made her peace with the math. What she had not made peace with, and had in fact refused to, was the idea that her circumstances should diminish her capacity to show up fully for the people around her. Her colleagues at Magnolia Gardens had, over the years, made a gentle habit of teasing her about her generosity. There was the time she gave the last $20 in her wallet to a family in the facility parking lot who had driven 3 hours and had no money for the return trip. There was the time she covered 2 extra shifts for a colleague whose child was sick, even though she herself was running a low-grade fever she had been ignoring for 3 days. Angela, one of them, A woman named Brianna had said to her once in the break room, "You would give your last $10 to a stranger and then walk home in the rain and call it a good day." Angela had laughed. She had not disagreed. It was simply who she was. It had been who she was since her mother sat her down at age 7 and said, "Baby, the world will try to teach you to be hard. Don't let it." Angela had taken that lesson with both hands and held it close for 23 years. That philosophy, that deep and unshakable habit of choosing kindness, was the single quality that would redirect the entire current of her life. On the night the rain came down over Atlanta and a stranger collapsed in front of a bus shelter, she almost walked past him. That was the truth she would return to many times in the years that followed the plain, unglamorous fact that her first instinct had been to keep moving. It was nearly 11:30 at night. She was exhausted in the particular way that comes not just from physical labor, but from the emotional weight of caring for people who are suffering. Her feet hurt, her back ached. The rain was cold, and she had at least another 20 minutes of walking before she reached her front door. The man she saw hunched beneath the plastic shelter of the bus stop was elderly, perhaps 60, perhaps older. It was difficult to say in the poor light. He wore a jacket that had once been navy blue, but had faded to something closer to gray. His shoes were canvas, completely soaked through, inappropriate for any weather colder than late summer. He was sitting on the bench with his head down and his arms folded tight across his chest, in the posture of someone trying to make themselves as small as possible against the cold. Angela glanced at him. She slowed. She told herself. It was not her problem. She took 4 more steps, and then she heard the sound, a dull, heavy thud, and turned to find the man face down on the concrete beneath the shelter. One arm stretched out ahead of him, the other pinned beneath his body. She was at his side, before she had consciously decided to move. He was conscious, which was the first relief. She turned him gently onto his side, checked his breathing, spoke to him in the calm, practiced voice she used with patients who were frightened. "I've got you," she said. "You're okay. Can you tell me your name?" The man blinked up at her, through the rain that was now sheeting sideways off the shelter's edge and spattering across his face. His eyes were dark and clear, not confused the way eyes sometimes were in a medical emergency, but aware, almost measuring. "James," he said. His voice was low and even, rougher at the edges than she might have expected from a man his age, with the faint residue of an accent she could not immediately place. "Are you hurt?" she asked. He shook his head slowly and allowed her to help him sit upright against the bench. "Just tired," he said, "and cold." She sat beside him for a long moment, rain drumming against the plastic roof above them, the street entirely empty in both directions. She ran through the calculation quickly in her mind, the shelters nearby, the nearest emergency room, the last bus of the night that might still be running. Then she ran through a different, quieter calculation, the one that had no variables except her own conscience. She thought about her mother. She thought about what Darlene would have done. The answer was not complicated. "I live 8 blocks from here," Angela said. "You can sleep on my couch tonight. Just tonight." The man looked at her steadily for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you," he said. When they stood and began walking, she noticed that he looked once, briefly, at the skyline visible in the distance, at the cluster of glass towers whose upper floors were still lit even at this hour, and something moved across his face that she could not name. Not longing, not bitterness, something more private than either of those things. She did not ask about it. She was too tired, and it was not her business, and the rain was not letting up. She turned her collar up and walked, and the man called James walked beside her, and neither of them said a word for the remaining 8 blocks. His name, he told her over the bowl of leftover soup she heated up, while he sat at her small kitchen table with a towel around his shoulders, was James. He did not offer a last name, and she did not ask for one. He looked around her apartment, with the careful attention of someone who notices things without making a show of noticing them. The stack of nursing reference books on the shelf, the framed photograph of her mother on the wall, the small collection of potted herbs on the windowsill that she had been trying and largely failing to keep alive. He thanked her for the soup in a way that was formal without being stiff, as though courtesy was simply a language he spoke fluently. She asked him if he was from Atlanta. He said no. He had grown up in the Midwest, traveled a great deal, ended up here for reasons he was still working out. She did not press. She had worked long enough with people in difficult circumstances to know that sometimes the story was not ready to be told, and the kindest thing you could do was simply not demand it. She made up the couch with the extra blanket from the closet shelf, set out a clean towel, showed him where the bathroom was, and told him she would be up by 6 in the morning for her early shift. He nodded and said he would be gone before then. She believed him. She went to bed. She did not fall asleep immediately. Through the thin wall between her bedroom and the living room, she could hear him moving quietly, the soft creak of the couch, the sound of him setting something on the coffee table, the occasional low clearing of his throat. At some point, she had reached over and picked up the paperback she kept on her nightstand, a popular biography of a jazz musician she had been working through for 2 weeks. She read 3 pages before she heard him shift on the couch and say, quietly, "That's a good book." She startled, then realized he must have seen it on the table before she came to bed. She called back, "You've read it?" There was a brief pause. "Twice," he said. Then, after another pause, "The part in Chapter 7, where he talks about improvisation as a form of trust. That's worth thinking about." She set the book down and stared at the ceiling. The comment was oddly precise, not the observation of someone who had glanced at a cover, but of someone who had actually read and considered the work. She let the quiet settle back into the apartment. After a while she slept, but she found herself, in the formless way of nearly asleep thoughts, turning the comment over. Something about the way he talked did not match the image of the man she had helped off the wet concrete of a bus stop. The vocabulary was too exact, the observation too considered. She filed it away under the general category of things she did not understand and fell into a dreamless sleep. She woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of a phone ringing, a low, muffled sound, quickly silenced, followed by the soft pad of footsteps toward the balcony door. She heard it open, heard the brief wash of rain-cooled night air, heard the door close again. She was not fully awake, and under ordinary circumstances she might have simply rolled over and returned to sleep. But there was something in the quality of the man's voice that reached her through the glass, not the words, which she could not make out, but the tone. It was not the voice of someone lost or frightened. It was calm, deliberate, the voice of someone accustomed to making decisions that mattered. She heard 3 fragments of sentences before sleep pulled her back down. "I'm still safe," she heard. And then, "Don't send anyone." And then, after a long pause, "I'll come back when I'm ready." She did not process what she had heard until morning. By then, he was already gone. He had left the blanket folded neatly at one end of the couch. The bowl from the previous night was rinsed and turned upside down in the dish rack. On the coffee table, he had left a business card, small, slightly worn at one corner, printed on heavy cream-colored stock with an embossed border. Angela picked it up and turned it over without really looking at it, then set it on the kitchen counter beside her keys. She was running late, her mind already cycling through the tasks of the day ahead, and she did not stop to read the name printed on the card. She tucked it into the small ceramic dish where she kept loose coins and receipts, and she left for her shift. The apartment was quiet and smelled faintly of rain, and the whole episode already had the slightly unreal quality of something that had happened longer ago than it actually had. She thought about the old man briefly on the bus ride and thought about his careful speech, the unexpectedly perceptive remark about the book, the phone call in the dark, and then the bus reached her stop, and she put him out of her mind and went to work. She would not think about him again for nearly 3 weeks. Life, as it reliably did, moved on without sentiment. October gave way to the first cold edge of November, and Angela's life contracted around its own pressures the way it always did when the seasons turned. Her landlord, a property management company she had never met in person, sent a letter in the second week of the month notifying her that her rent would increase by $130 beginning in January. She read the letter twice at her kitchen table and then set it face down on the counter and sat very still for a while, doing the math she already knew the answer to. $130 was not an abstract number. It was the difference between groceries and a choice. She had already been running the numbers tight enough that a single unexpected expense, a medical bill, a car repair, a broken appliance, could tip her into genuine difficulty. And then, 12 days after the rent notice arrived, her car gave out. It was an 11-year-old sedan she had bought secondhand 3 years earlier for $4,000, and maintained with the same careful attention she gave everything she owned. It had served her faithfully, and now it was done. The repair estimate was $1,800, which she did not have. Without the car, getting to her early morning shifts, the ones that started before the first bus of the day ran, would require a taxi she also could not afford. She spoke to her supervisor, a practical and not unkind woman named Donna, who told her they would try to work around her schedule, but could not promise anything. Angela thanked her. She went home. She sat on her couch in the apartment and looked at the wall and thought, not for the first time, that the distance between where she was and where she needed to be was a gap that no amount of hard work had ever managed to fully close. She did not cry. She was not, by nature, a person who used tears as a first response. Instead, she made a list, a plain, numbered list of options available to her. And she looked at it with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to everything. None of the options were good. All of them were survivable. She went to bed. The business card sat in the ceramic dish beside her keys, still unread. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 41 degrees, and somewhere in the city, Elijah Carter was already instructing his attorney to prepare a particular envelope. His name was not James. She learned this on a Thursday morning in the third week of November, when she came out of her apartment building at 8:30 to find a black car idling at the curb, in a way that black cars did not typically idle in front of buildings like hers. It was not quite a limousine. It was a long, dark sedan, polished to a depth that reflected the gray sky above in something close to mirror quality. A man stood beside it. He was perhaps 50, trim, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him with the kind of precision that costs money. He held a slim leather document folder in one hand. When he saw her come through the lobby door, he straightened and said her name. Angela Brooks? She stopped. Her first thought, trained by years of living in financial precarity, was that someone had come to deliver bad news of the official variety, an eviction notice, a collections letter, made physical and personal. She squared her shoulders. Yes, she said. The man extended a card. My name is David Harlow, he said. I'm an attorney. I represent a client named Elijah Carter. I believe you may know him. Angela looked at the card, then at the man, and shook her head slowly. I don't know anyone by that name, she said. David Harlow reached into his document folder and withdrew a photograph. He held it out to her. It was a professional headshot, clearly taken in a formal context. A man in his 60s, well-dressed, silver-haired, with dark, clear eyes, and the composed expression of someone who has spent decades having their photograph taken. Angela stared at it. The eyes were the same, the set of the jaw was the same, the quality of attention in that face was unmistakably the same. The man in the photograph was the man she had helped off the pavement at a bus stop in the rain on a Tuesday night in October. The man whose blanket she had found folded on her couch the next morning, the man who had told her his name was James. That's him, she said, quietly. That's the man who stayed here. David Harlow nodded. He said, Mr. Carter would like a few moments of your time, Miss Brooks, if you're willing. There are some things he'd like you to know. She sat in the back of the sedan with the attorney while the driver kept the engine running, and she listened to what David Harlow told her. Elijah Carter was 71 years old. He had founded a technology company called Meridian Systems 32 years ago in a converted garage in Columbus, Ohio, starting with nothing but a software concept he had worked on for 6 years while teaching high school mathematics. Meridian had grown, over the following 3 decades, into one of the largest enterprise software companies in the United States, a firm with operations in 14 countries, annual revenues in the billions, and a market capitalization that placed its founder consistently in the upper tier of the Forbes 400 list of wealthiest Americans. His face had appeared on the cover of business publications. His foundation had funded hospitals and schools across the southeastern United States. He had been, by any conventional measure, one of the most successful, self-made entrepreneurs of his generation. 6 weeks before the night he sat down at Angela's bus stop, Elijah Carter had done something no one in his circle had anticipated. He had walked out of the private medical facility where he had been recovering from a minor cardiac procedure, told no one where he was going, and disappeared. His security team had been searching for him. His attorney had been managing a careful, increasingly anxious circle of senior staff who had been told only that Mr. Carter was taking an unscheduled leave of absence. The press had not yet gotten hold of the story. His instructions, conveyed through David Harlow before he left, had been 3 sentences long. Do not call the police. Do not issue a public statement. And trust that he would return when he was ready. Angela listened to all of this without interrupting. When David Harlow finished, she said, "Why?" The attorney paused. He looked at her with something that was not quite admiration but was close to it. "He'll explain that in his own words," Harlow said. "He left something for you." The envelope was cream-colored, the same shade as the business card she had never read. Her name was written on the front in a careful, deliberate hand, not the hurried signature of someone accustomed to delegating, but the considered script of someone who had wanted to write this particular name themselves. She opened it in her kitchen after the attorney had gone, sitting at the same small table where she had heated soup for a stranger on a rainy October night. Inside were 2 items. The first was a letter, handwritten on 3 pages of heavy stationery, in the same careful script as the envelope. The second was a document she did not immediately understand, a legal certificate of some kind, dense with language about equity shares and corporate holdings, with her name typed clearly in one of the formal fields near the top. She set the document aside and read the letter first. Elijah Carter had written, in a voice that was direct and unadorned, and entirely devoid of the careful positioning she would later learn characterized most of his public communication, that he had spent the previous 18 months in the grip of a disillusionment so profound it had begun to feel like grief. He had been betrayed, he wrote, by a man he had trusted for 12 years, a business partner who had engineered a scheme so thorough and so personal that it had cost Elijah not only money, which he could absorb, but something closer to his belief in the possibility of genuine loyalty. He had watched, in the months that followed, as people he had considered friends revealed themselves to be calculating at best and corrupt at worst. His own brother-in-law had approached him about restructuring a portion of the family trust in a way that would have enriched himself significantly at others' expense. An executive he had mentored for 8 years had gone to a competitor and taken proprietary information with him. Elijah wrote that he was not, by temperament, a man who suffered bitterness easily, but he had reached a point, somewhere in the gray fluorescent days of his recovery from the cardiac procedure, where he had begun to sincerely wonder whether the goodness he had always believed resided in most people was a thing he had simply been naive enough to invent. The cardiac episode itself had been minor, a warning, his cardiologist called it, rather than an event. But it had clarified something. He had lain in the hospital bed and thought about his life, and decided that before he returned to it in full, he wanted to answer one question for himself. He wanted to know whether, stripped of every signal of wealth and power and reputation, he could still find in the world what his own mother had told him as a boy was always there if you looked for it. Plain human decency, offered without calculation, from one person to another in a moment of need. He had stayed at 4 different locations during his weeks away. He had sought help, in his disguise of worn clothing and deliberate shabbiness, from many people. A woman in a grocery store parking lot had looked right through him. A man outside a fast food restaurant had told him to move along. A young couple at a gas station had crossed to the other side of the pump island when he approached. A church volunteer had pointed him to a different block without making eye contact. A security guard at a downtown office plaza had asked him 3 times to leave before he had even spoken a word. He had sat on public benches and watched people navigate around him, the way water moves around a stone, not with cruelty exactly, but with the automated efficiency of people who had trained themselves not to see what was inconvenient to see. He was not angry. He had expected some version of this. What he had not expected was how consistent it would be, how thorough the invisibility, how complete the disappearance of a person from the social field once the markers of wealth and status were removed. It confirmed, in the most direct, empirical sense he could have designed, what he had been afraid was true. That much of the warmth he had experienced in his life had been addressed not to him, but to his circumstances. He had noted these things the way a scientist notes data. And then, on a Tuesday night in October, in the rain, at a bus stop on Peachtree and Vine, he had looked up from the concrete where he had fallen, genuinely fallen, not staged, exhaustion, having finally outrun his plan, and found a young woman kneeling beside him in the rain, without having asked herself first whether it was worth her time. She had spoken to him in the voice of someone who had been trained to care for people, but the training was not the thing he noticed. What he noticed was that she was tired. He could see it in the set of her face, in the way she carried herself. She was not helping him because she had energy to spare. She was helping him because it was simply what she did with whatever energy she had. That, he wrote, was the thing that had broken something open in him. Not gratitude exactly. Something larger than gratitude. Something closer to restoration. Angela set the letter down on the table and pressed her palms flat against its surface and breathed slowly for a long moment. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, a car passed. She picked the letter up again and kept reading. He had sat in her living room while she slept and thought about what she had said to him that evening. The small, unremarkable things she had told him about her day, her patience, the woman in room 7 who had finally started eating again, the old man in room 12 who had asked her to read to him from the sports page. She had spoken of these things without complaint and without performance. She had simply reported the ordinary details of a life spent in service to others, in the same tone another person might use to describe the weather. He had thought, listening to her from the kitchen table, that this was the real thing, not dramatic, not dressed up, just real. And he had decided, lying on her couch under her extra blanket, that whatever he could do to make her life reflect the quality of the life she was living, he was going to do it. The legal document, which she picked up with slightly unsteady hands, after finishing the letter, was a certificate transferring to Angela Renee Brooks a 3% equity stake in the Meridian Systems subsidiary, responsible for the company's nonprofit and community development contracts. The document was accompanied by a notarized letter from Meridian's board of directors confirming the transfer. David Harlow had included a separate note, paper clipped to the front, explaining that at the current valuation of the relevant subsidiary, the 3% stake represented a present value of approximately $4.2 million, and that dividends from that stake had already begun accruing to an account opened in Angela's name at a private bank in Midtown Atlanta. She read the note 3 times. She was still sitting at the kitchen table 20 minutes later when David Harlow, who had not left the building but had been waiting in the lobby with the patience of someone who had learned to wait, knocked gently on her door to ask if she had questions. She opened the door. She looked at him. She said, "I can't accept this." He nodded, unsurprised. "Mr. Carter expected you to say that," he said. "He asked me to give you one more thing before you make that decision." He held out a second envelope. Inside was a single typed page. It read, in its entirety, "You are not being paid for your kindness. Kindness cannot be paid for. What I am doing is returning to you the faith that your mother put into this world when she raised you to be who you are. Use it well." Che. She accepted it. She accepted it because she understood in the end that refusing it would not have been humility. It would have been a different kind of pride, the kind that mistakes smallness for virtue. She accepted it because Elijah Carter was not giving her a reward. He was, as the note said, giving her back something that already belonged to her, in a form that could actually be used. But there was still one more piece, and it was the piece that would consume the next chapter of her life entirely. David Harlow returned 3 days later with a second set of documents. These were longer, more complex, and took almost 2 hours for him to walk her through. In brief, Elijah Carter had established, through his foundation, a new charitable organization called the Open Door Fund. The fund was capitalized at $38 million. Its stated mission was to provide direct financial support, housing assistance, and vocational training to elderly individuals experiencing homelessness, to children living below the poverty line in the Atlanta metropolitan area, and to single-parent households facing acute housing insecurity. The fund needed a director, someone who understood, from the inside, what it meant to live on the edge of financial collapse and still choose to give. Someone who could be trusted not to let an institution built on the principle of genuine human decency become something cold and bureaucratic and managed from a distance. Elijah Carter had nominated Angela Brooks for the position. The compensation was a salary she had never imagined earning. The responsibility was unlike anything she had ever held. She would be stepping off the ledge of everything she knew onto something entirely new. She sat with those documents for a long time. She called no one, because there was no one to call. She walked around her small apartment and looked at the herbs in the window and her mother's photograph and the stack of nursing books on the shelf. She thought about what her mother had told her when she was 7 years old, about the world and its attempts to make you hard. She thought about the man who had sat at her kitchen table eating soup, who had not been what he appeared, but who had been, beneath the layers of wealth and reputation and disguise, simply a person who had been hurt and was trying to find his way back to believing in something. She thought about the question he had asked her on her doorstep that morning. Do you still believe in kindness? She thought about the answer she had given him without a moment's hesitation. And then she picked up the phone and called David Harlow and told him she would do it. She gave her notice at Magnolia Gardens on a Monday morning. Donna, her supervisor, listened to the entire story without interrupting, and at the end of it she sat back in her chair and looked at Angela for a long moment, and then said, simply, "Baby, you deserve every bit of it." Angela packed her things from her locker that afternoon, the extra pair of shoes she kept under the bench, the photographs she had taped to the inside of the door, the small container of hand lotion that her patient Gerald had given her for her birthday 3 months ago. Gerald himself was brought the news by the afternoon nurse, who reported later that he had listened to the story very carefully, thought about it for a moment, and then said, "I always knew Sunshine was going to go somewhere big." She gave him the hand lotion back. He refused it. She left it on his nightstand anyway. The transition to the Open Door Fund took 3 months of preparation meetings with attorneys, with Meridian's philanthropy team, with community organizations across Atlanta that the fund would partner with housing specialists and social workers and city administrators who had been working the problem of elderly homelessness and childhood poverty for years without adequate resources. Angela learned that there were approximately 1,300 elderly individuals experiencing homelessness in the Atlanta metro area on any given night. She learned that among children under 12, in the same region, 1 in 5 lived in a household earning below the federal poverty line. She learned the names and the systems and the gaps in those systems, and she applied to all of it the same quality of attention she had brought to her work at Magnolia Gardens: thorough, patient, personally invested in the individual behind every statistic. When the fund officially opened its doors in February of the following year, it did so with the quiet, deliberate confidence of something that had been built by someone who understood both the weight of the problem and the dignity of the people it was meant to serve. The first year was hard, not in the ways she had feared, not from lack of resources or institutional support, both of which David Harlow proved expert at providing, but in the ways that real work is always hard, which is to say, it was the difficulty of trying to do something meaningful in a world that had developed many complex systems designed to resist change. There were applications to process and denials to appeal and partner organizations with competing priorities, and city officials whose support was conditional on factors that shifted without warning. There were nights when Angela came home to the apartment she had moved to larger now, with actual bedroom doors, and a kitchen where 2 people could stand, without touching, and sat at the table and wondered if she was equal to the thing she had agreed to do. On those nights she sometimes thought about Elijah Carter, about the question he had asked her on that October morning, about the answer she had given. She would think about what it meant to believe in something not because you had proof of it, but because the alternative was a kind of poverty more absolute than anything she had known. And she would get up the next morning and go to the office and do the work. In the first 12 months of operation, the Open Door Fund provided emergency housing assistance to 263 elderly individuals in the Atlanta metro area. It funded after-school programs and tutoring services for over 1,000 children in 8 underserved school districts. It provided job training and vocational certification to 142 adults, the majority of them single mothers, enabling them to qualify for employment at a wage above the poverty line. It partnered with 6 food banks, 3 public health clinics, and 11 community organizations to extend its reach into neighborhoods that had historically received the least institutional investment. Angela had insisted, from the beginning, that the fund operate with a philosophy of radical directness, that the people it served should never have to navigate a maze of forms and requirements and waiting periods that made asking for help feel like punishment. She had experienced enough of that system from the other side to know how dehumanizing it could be. The fund's intake process was, by design, as simple as possible. One interview, one set of documents, one decision within 5 business days. The staff she hired were people who had, many of them, lived inside the problems the fund was trying to solve. They were not academics or administrators. They were people who understood, from their own experience, what it meant to need help and to find a door that actually opened. These were not abstract numbers. Angela knew many of the people behind them by name. She had met them in intake interviews, in community meetings, in the hallways of the partner organizations that were doing the daily work of implementation. She had sat across a table from a 78-year-old woman named Ruth, who had lost her apartment after her fixed income could no longer cover the rent increase that had been imposed by a landlord who knew she had nowhere else to go. She had shaken hands with a 14-year-old named Marcus, who had gone from failing 8th grade to being accepted into a selective summer science program at Georgia Tech after 2 semesters of tutoring funded by the Open Door grant. She had watched, at a job fair the fund co-sponsored, a woman named Denise receive her phlebotomy certification and burst into tears that she did not try to hide. Angela did not experience any of this as remarkable. She experienced it as work, as the daily application of resources to problems that had always had solutions, just never enough funding to implement them at the scale they required. But sometimes, in the quiet after a long day, she allowed herself to feel it for what it also was, something that mattered, something that would continue mattering long after any individual involved in it was gone. Elijah Carter died in the spring of the following year, 14 months after the Open Door Fund was established. He had returned to public life the previous November, appearing at a Meridian shareholder meeting with his customary composure, and the story of his disappearance had leaked gradually and incompletely into the business press, where it generated the kind of coverage that is simultaneously breathless and largely beside the point. He had continued to correspond with Angela by letter, not email, but actual letters, written in the same careful hand as the first one, and she had written back. Their correspondence was not intimate in the way of friends exactly, but it was warm and honest, and she had come to understand through it that Elijah Carter was, at his core, a person who had spent most of his life trying to be good in circumstances that made goodness genuinely difficult. He had not always succeeded, he said so plainly, but he had kept trying, and that, he wrote to her once in a letter she would keep for the rest of her life, was the whole of what he believed could be asked of anyone. He died on a Tuesday morning in April, of a second cardiac event that his cardiologist had believed was coming, but had not been able to prevent. He was 72 years old. He left behind a foundation, a company, a family that was more complicated than it appeared from the outside, and a letter that David Harlow delivered to Angela 3 days after the funeral, which said only, "Thank you for opening the door. Everything after that was easy." She went to the cemetery on a Saturday in May, 6 weeks after his death, when the city had passed through the worst of the spring heat into the softer air of late morning. She had brought one thing. The business card, small, slightly worn at one corner, printed on heavy, cream-colored stock with embossed borders, the card she had picked up from her coffee table on that October morning and tossed into the ceramic dish beside her keys without reading it. She had finally read it, months ago, and found on it the name and title she had not known on the morning it was left for her: Elijah Carter, founder and chairman, Meridian Systems. She stood at his grave for a long time without saying anything, the card held loosely in her hand, the city audible in the middle distance, a pair of birds conducting some urgent business in the oak tree above the headstone. The stone itself was simple, plainer than she would have expected for a man of his means, bearing only his name and the years of his birth and death, and a single line she did not recognize as a quotation, but which felt, standing there in the May morning light, like something he would have said. He looked for what was good in people and found it. She thought about the rain. She thought about the 8 blocks she had walked with a stranger through a dark, wet night, not knowing who he was or what would follow, knowing only that he was cold and that she was able to help. She thought about all the nights before that one, when the same cold calculation had resolved itself the same way, without reward, without recognition, without anything except the quiet knowledge that she had done what her mother had taught her to do. She thought about what it meant that the accumulated weight of all those ordinary, unrewarded choices had somehow added up to this, to the hundreds of people housed and the thousands of children tutored, and the women with their new certifications standing in employment lines that led somewhere real. She placed the business card at the base of the headstone, where the grass was still soft from a recent rain. She stood there a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back through the cemetery toward the gate, her coat open in the warm spring air, her face composed and calm, and already thinking about the week ahead and the work that waited there for her. The lesson, if there was one, and Angela had come to believe there was, though she did not advertise it, was not the one that the obvious version of this story might suggest. It was not that kindness is always rewarded, because she knew better than that. She had been kind to people who had taken from her and not looked back. She had given time and money she could not spare to situations that had not improved, to people who had not changed, to causes that had not prevailed. There had been the colleague who borrowed $50 and never mentioned it again. There had been the neighbor she had driven to medical appointments 3 times who moved away without saying goodbye. There had been the difficult patient she had sat with for hours through a long night, who told the facility manager the following week that the staff were inattentive. None of these outcomes had changed her. They had hurt sometimes, in the small, specific way that disappointment always hurts when it comes from a direction you were not defending. But they had not changed the fundamental calculation she made every morning when she got up and went out into the world, that the way you treated people was not a transaction. It was not a bet. It was not an audition. The real lesson was something quieter and, she thought, more durable. It was that kindness does not require a return to justify itself. It is not an investment strategy. It is not a performance for an audience. It is simply the decision, made again and again in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life, to treat the person in front of you as though they matter because they do, regardless of who they turn out to be, regardless of what follows, regardless of whether anyone is watching. Elijah Carter had turned out to be a billionaire, with a foundation and a lawyer and a document that changed the arithmetic of Angela's life entirely. But he might just as easily have been exactly what he appeared, a cold and tired old man who needed a place to sleep. And Angela, on that rainy Tuesday night, had not known the difference. That was the point. That was what her mother had been trying to tell her. All those years ago in the small house in Mechanicsville, pressing school uniforms on Sunday nights and leaving hot breakfast on the table before dawn. You do not wait to know the outcome before you decide to be good. You are good, and then you see what the world does with it. Kindness is not always rewarded. But sometimes, what stands between a miracle and an ordinary day is nothing more than the decision to open a door to a stranger standing in the rain and the years of patient, unassuming goodness that made that decision feel, in the moment it mattered most, like the only natural thing in the world.